Module 3. Details of the axial skeleton, the skull. Well, it's time now to begin a deeper look at the axial skeleton. The skull is composed of 28 different bones. You may be surprised to hear that these bones are not connected by movable joints. And that's a good thing because otherwise your head would change in shape. The only bone that can easily separate from the other bones of the skull is the mandible or jawbone. The rest of the bones are tightly fitted together. Now, you already are likely aware that the major job of the skull is to provide support and protection for the brain, as well as the eyes and other features in the head. This is a listing of the groups of skull bones. We will look at all of these groups. Looking at the skull from its posterior or back side, you can see several types of bones. 2 parietal bones, the occipital bone, and 2 temporal bones. You can also see 2 palatine bones, which form the palate. The location where all of these bones meet is called a suture. A suture is an immovable joint between flat bones of the skull. In this diagram, you can also see the mastoid process. A process is a projection on a bone. It's a part of the bone that projects or proceeds outward. Muscles that help to move the head attach at the mastoid process, which is a projection on the temporal bone. This is a better angle to see where the mastoid process is located. You can feel this extension located behind your ear on your own skull. Looking back at the posterior view of the skull, you can see the superior and inferior nuchal lines. These lines are where neck muscles attach to the skull bones. The superior line is above, or superior to, the inferior line. Now let's take a look at the lateral view. If you're familiar with football, you know a lateral pass is a pass thrown to the side. Well, in anatomy, lateral means away from the middle, or to the side. In this lateral view, you can again see one of the 2 parietal bones, one of the 2 temporal bones, and the single occipital bone. You can also see the frontal bone, the single sphenoid bone, and one of the 2 lacrimal bones. The word lacrimal refers to tears, so you can see why this bone is given its name. And here is one of the 2 nasal bones. The nasal bones don't look very much like a nose because much of your nose is composed of cartilage. We call the 2 zygomatic bones cheekbones, and there's a process on these bones to join to a process from the temporal bones, forming the zygomatic arch. You can see how that arch forms a ridge across both sides of the skull. Each of the zygomatic bones is attached to one of the 2 maxilla bones. The maxilla bones hold the upper or superior set of teeth. There is a single mandible, which is located inferior to or below the maxillae, and it holds the inferior set of teeth. The mandible is the only bone in the skull that can move, and that's helpful because its movement allows you to eat and to speak. There's a final bone you can see here. It's the single ethmoid bone found between the eyes. The external auditory meatus is the opening through which sound waves travel on their way to the eardrum. A meatus is the anatomical term for a passageway. So the external auditory meatus is the outer or external passageway through which you hear. The mental foramen is also something you can see in this view of the skull. A foramen is an anatomical term for a hole. This hole is for the mental nerve to pass through. Now let's look at the anterior view of the skull. You can again see some of the bones I have already covered. The frontal bone, the parietal bones, the sphenoid bone, the lacrimal bones, the nasal bones, the temporal bones, the maxillae, plural of maxilla, and the mandible. The new bone we can see from this view is the vomer. This bone, along with a part of the ethmoid bone, forms the bony part of the nasal septum. This septum separates or divides the nasal cavity in 2. Many of the bones in the nasal cavity area have hollow areas. These regions are covered with a thin membrane of pseudostratified epithelium. We call each region a sinus. A sinus is a hollowed-out space in a bone. Bone sinuses associated with the nasal cavity are called the paranasal sinuses. These lined, hollowed out spaces keep the skull from weighing too much and also affect how your voice sounds. That's why your voice sounds differently when you have a cold and your sinuses are congested. The final feature in the skull are its orbits. These are the locations of your eyes. The orbits protect your eyes and are formed by 7 different bones.